Ladies and gentlemen, as you know, one of my great mentors was Attorney General Edwin Meese. And somebody who I got to know very, very well there, a gentleman by the name of Steven Calabresi, who's now a law professor, has been for some time actually, and Gary Lawson, who also worked at the Department of Justice, law professor. And Ed Meese's impact on the rule of law, on what we call constitutional originalism, things that you see taking place on the Supreme Court by the good guys, things that they've written, wasn't always that way. And there's a fantastic new book out called The Meese Revolution, which was written by Professor Calabresi and Gary Lawson, and is such a fantastic explanation of what took place in this country. It was a true revolution, a legal revolution that still has an impact today. And it's a pleasure to bring my friend Steven Calabresi, professor, on the program. Steve, how are you, my friend?
Terrific, Mark. Thrilled to be on the program and honored to be on the program. And I'm coming to you having just talked about the book at Yale Law School and Stanford Law School and the Hoover Institution, and have been touting its benefits.
Well, now you get to talk to real people. Who,
exactly.
Who,
exactly.
many of them.
Important.
Yes.
This is the important audience. The other audience is hostile and not important. But
no.
The message of the book is that Ed Meese is the greatest Attorney General of the 86 people who've held the job over the last 235 years, and we were both privileged to know him and work for him.
And why is that? You know, he came to the Department of Justice. He had worked for Ronald Reagan in California. He held legal positions there. He held political positions. He was his top confidant. They tried to prevent him from coming to the Department of Justice. He fights through all that. He becomes the Attorney General of the United States. And when you first met him, when you first knew him, did you think he would be this brilliant, masterful sort of philosopher in the law who would take the American experience of the American Constitution and press it in every corner of our republic?
I did not expect. I had high expectations for what it would be like to work for him. I started in June of 1987, but I never imagined that he would launch a sea change in American constitutional law. And he started that sea change on July 9th, 1987, when he spoke to the American Bar Association and graded the Supreme Court on its past term. And he gave the court an F on federalism, a solid B on criminal procedure, and an F on religious liberty, and announced that henceforth the Justice Department, in all of its briefs and opinions and in the judges it appoints, would promote a jurisprudence of original intention. And that was an historic change that has led to the 6-justice majority on the Roberts Court that we've seen in the last few years. And it's just an extraordinary change.
But he was also involved, wasn't he, in the appointment of Antonin Scalia, of William Rehnquist as Chief Justice. He had an enormous impact on the court, didn't he?
Absolutely, yes. When former Chief Justice Berger retired, he advised President Reagan to replace him with William Rehnquist as Chief Justice, and then to appoint 50-year-old Justice Antonin Scalia to the vacancy. And in doing that, General Meese replaced the second most conservative member of the Berger Court with the best Chief Justice in American history, and along with Justice Thomas, one of the 2 best associate justices in American history. And that was really his doing. I mean, President Reagan trusted him and followed his judgment, but he led the way in causing the Rehnquist and Scalia appointments to happen.
And what did he do in terms of advancing the argument? I mean, he was tireless, almost like Trump here, in giving speeches all over the country, giving speeches to bar associations, legal associations. And you're right, all the filings of the Department of Justice, criminal, civil, antitrust, whatever it was, it had this new birth of American constitutionalism that was spread throughout all of it, didn't it?
Absolutely. He gave more than 30 historic speeches, and it's tremendous fun to go back and reread them. He gave further speeches, elaborating on why originalism was a great idea and rebutting criticisms that had been made of originalism by liberal justices William Brennan and John Paul Stevens. And he gave speeches on the importance of federalism and reviving the idea that the federal government is one of limited and enumerated powers. He called for the overruling of the administrative state.
So the heavy lifting for this book was by Professors Calabresi and Lawson. They honored me with allowing me to write the foreword to the book, which I was happy to do. I'm glad I did. The Meese Revolution is the name of the book, The Making of a Constitutional Movement, and that's the key. It is a constitutional movement. It's an ongoing constitutional movement. Now, Professor Calabresi, seems to me there's only one legitimate way, isn't there, to interpret the Constitution, and that's called originalism. It doesn't mean that those who practice it come up with the same result. You know, Thomas and Scalia didn't always come up with the same result, and there are various tributaries to that kind of thinking, but at least you're in the right ballpark, correct?
That's exactly right, Mark. I mean, the only way to interpret the Constitution is to give the words the meaning they had when they were originally adopted. And it turns out that when you do that, there is no made-up right to an abortion in the Constitution. There's no made-up permission for affirmative action in the Constitution. There is a Second Amendment that protects the right to keep guns in your home and to carry them with you in self-defense. Just so many important rights that are being vindicated now by the Supreme Court are the result of Ed Meese focusing the justices' attention on the original meaning of the words of the Constitution. And the country should be deeply, deeply grateful to him for what he's done. I think he is the greatest Attorney General of the 86 Attorney Generals we've had. And he really led an intellectual revolution and a judicial revolution that is without precedent in American history.
Yeah, and he did it through persuasion. He did it through ideas.
Yep.
The filing of briefs, essays, speeches, law review articles, and on and on and on. And through personnel, correct? Because the personnel at the Department of Justice were very carefully picked, weren't they?
They were very carefully picked, and Ed was certain to pick only people who were loyal to his and President Reagan's agenda. And Ed Meese's Justice Department picked some absolutely superb federal judges, not only Chief Justice Rehnquist and Justice Scalia, but also many, many other federal court of appeals and trial court judges. And Mr. Meese spoke about the importance of originalism in more than 30 historic speeches. He had the Office of Legal Policy in the Justice Department issue more than 30 100-page monographs on the original meaning of different clauses in the Constitution. Chuck Cooper, who ran the Office of Legal Counsel for him, issued an opinion in 1986 saying that Congress didn't have the enumerated power to create a national lottery. That was 9 years before the Supreme Court in the United States against Lopez began enforcing enumerated powers again. It was really the first time since 1937 that somebody had doubted whether the federal government had the power to do something. So it was truly historic.
Mm-hmm. And you're right about the judges. I mean, we won't name them all because the public won't know what we mean, but we're talking about real, serious, brilliant men and women who, and he chose them as young as he could, so they'd be on the bench for a long time too, right?
Well, and a number of them are still on the bench and active now. Here in Chicago, Frank Easterbrook is still hearing cases. He was appointed by Mr. Meese and Ronald Reagan, I think, at the age of 37.
Can I tell you a story about that real fast?
Yeah. Yeah, of course.
I was at the White House at the time, and my portfolio included working on federal judges in the Presidential Personnel Office under John Harrington.
Uh-huh.
And I worked very closely with Ken Cribb and John Richardson, who worked for Attorney General Meese, who was then counselor to the president. And so I'm looking for a very young, brilliant person to be a judge on the circuit. And I called Bob Bork.
Uh-huh.
He recommended Easterbrook. I recommended Easterbrook to Ken and John, and Ken and John, well, we know who he is. And so Easterbrook has been on the bench ever since. Isn't that amazing?
It is absolutely amazing. And in fact, Ken Cribb and John Richardson were key aides to Ed Meese in accomplishing what Ed was trying to do. And in particular, they identified people in their 30s to be judges and people in their 20s like me to be special assistants. And they knew that the older generation of Republicans didn't really embrace originalism or Ronald Reagan and all that he stood for. And so they went with very bright younger people. On Mr. Meese's advice, President Reagan appointed many very famous law professors to the federal courts, Robert Bork, Antonin Scalia, and others. Probably about 8 or 9 of them, very, very unusual number of law professors. But that's because Meese cared about ideas, and he wanted to change the legal culture. And boy, did he change the legal culture. It is so different today from what it was when I went to law school that, it's hard to describe.
And I want the public to know there was no real opposition to these activist courts, the activist Supreme Court. There was no real intellectual challenge. There were little, bonfires here and there, but not very much. And he coalesced them and he pressed them, and he just he kind of streamlined them. He made it cool to be out there and to be arguing really what the Constitution meant and so forth and so on. He really was, for all the talk about, he really was a revolutionary in that regard, wasn't he?
He was a radical revolutionary. He not only wanted to undo the excesses of the Warren and Burger Supreme Courts, he wanted to correct some of the mistakes Franklin Roosevelt made during the New Deal era. He called for holding independent agencies in the government unconstitutional, something the Supreme Court is now beginning to take up and act on. So the changes he proposed were sweeping. He's the only attorney general in American history to argue for a theory of how judges should interpret the Constitution and legal texts. All of the other attorney generals have been have not addressed issues as foundational as that. So in that respect, also, he's truly amazing, and it's just a great, great privilege to know him and work with him, and great privilege to talk with him, as I did just the other day about this book.
Book is The Meese Revolution, The Making of a Constitutional Moment. I really want to encourage you folks. It's very readable. Go on Amazon.com or wherever you like to buy your books and grab a copy. You're going to be fascinated by all this. It's not just for lawyers or law clerks or law professors or what. It's for you. This is your country. Now, you were one of the founders originally of the Federalist Society, and that also kind of grew out of the whole Meese movement, did it not?
Absolutely grew out of the Meese movement and out of the Reagan Revolution. President Reagan, when he was president, was supporting freedom fighters in Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and Angola against communists. And those of us who were Reaganites in law school in the early 1980s thought that we would be freedom fighters just like the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and the Contras in Nicaragua and UNITA in Angola, because actually universities were as leftist and hostile to Reagan as communism was. And that's what really was the impetus for the forming of the Federalist Society. Mr. Meese was kind enough to give many of his speeches at Federalist Society events, and he made the Federalist Society famous. And we've been able to pursue the mission of pushing for the appointment of originalist judges for the last 42 years, thanks to people like Mr. Meese and Justice Scalia and Judge Robert Bork, all of whom had placed great faith in us.
And you knew Antonin Scalia fairly well. We really do miss him, don't we?
I do really miss him terribly. It's very sad. February 13th will be the 9th anniversary of his death, and he was a loud and outspoken voice in defense of originalism and in defense of sensible readings of the Constitution. And I knew when he died that he was irreplaceable, and he has in fact been irreplaceable. But there are other good young justices who have stepped up and who are doing great things. And this current Supreme Court overruled Roe versus Wade in 2022, creating the national right to abortion, and it held that Harvard College couldn't discriminate on the basis of race against white men in 2023, and it found a right to carry a gun outside your home in 2023. So,
and that Chevron decision, the anti-Chevron decision, was mammoth.
That it was a huge decision, a huge, huge decision, because it said that judges would interpret the laws that govern government agencies, not the bureaucrats themselves. And so it was a reclaiming by judges of their power to interpret the laws.
So the bureaucracy wasn't in charge of making them and interpreting them, with very little opportunity for people to find a way to appeal them and to confront them. Yeah. And that was huge, right?
That was absolutely huge. And ultimately, one of the things that's the most important about originalism is that Ed Meese basically put the people back in charge of our democracy by diminishing the power of Supreme Court justices and confining the role of Supreme Court justices to interpreting the law and following it, and not to making it up, which is what the courts had been doing until very recently. So it's a really historic change, just an amazing change from anything that I saw when I was in law school, or even from what things were like 10 or 15 years ago. And Mr. Meese was instrumental in Supreme Court appointments long after he finished as Attorney General. He continued to lobby for the appointment of originalists to the Supreme Court, and he deserves a lot of credit for the originalists who've been put on the Supreme Court in the last 25 years. He was co-chairman of President Trump's transition team in 2016, and President Trump gave him the Medal of Freedom in 2019 in recognition of his great services to the country. And he's really he really is an historic figure, and it's just such an honor to know him and to have worked with him.
All right, Professor, we're going to have to run, but this is fascinating. We're going to bring you back, Mr. Producer. Let's bring Steve back in about 3 weeks. I want to pick up where we left off here, because I think Ed Meese is one of the underappreciated great heroes of republicanism and liberty in this country, and he did it in a legal way. So thank you for writing this fantastic book. That's number one.
Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, The Meese Revolution. Go to Amazon.com. Please grab your copy, folks. And Steve, we were going to have you back soon, because I got more I want to explore here. It's fascinating to me. Take care of yourself, brother.
Thank you. I will. I look forward to it, Mark.
All right.